train that came by, all the steam locomotives were tolling those big bells, and they just never stopped. It went on and on and on, and I was so excited because I knew that something wonderful had happened all over the world. And that is an experience that I'll never forget, and that maybe you can't quite pick up from reading about the history of the end of the war. Another thing that, of course, I lived through in John 2 was the Depression. And that was a very interesting experience, too, and it changed us. But we've never been able to really communicate to our children or our grandson why we have the attitudes about money that we do, in strong contrast to the attitudes that they had. What I really want to say here is that it's just very, very important to know something about the past. I think you need to know the past of your family. I think you need to know the past of your church, the past of your country, and the more you can know about it and really empathize with it, the more you'll really understand yourself, understand about life. Another thing I'd like to talk about is the view of time, how long ago really is long ago. I think I didn't realize how close long ago is until I began to study genealogy, and I found out that all my grandparents were alive during the Civil War, that one great uncle fought in it, and that I had a great-grandfather who fought in the War of 1812, and a great-great who was in the Revolution. And I began to realize that all these long-ago events were really much closer to me in time than I had thought that they were, and that one should really feel the closeness of the past. Then there's another aspect of time. That's the daily stages that we're in. And sometimes we have a problematic stage, we're having trouble with our kids, or we're having money problems or something or other, and life just feels really grim, and we just feel, oh, this is awful, this is going to go on forever. But as you get older, you realize that's not so. Everything keeps changing, and it changes rather rapidly and unexpectedly, and you have to realize that it will. So you go along, you deal with your problems, you don't worry, you just sort of accept the fact that things are going to change, and that what you considered very, very important at one time in your life, you find out wasn't really that important after all. Now, we have to deal with one other fact of time. That's the time when we're no longer here, really, to take part in that time. And that is a tough one, but maybe I can, well, at least say how I feel about it in these words. I have a letter here that was written by a cousin of my grandparents back in 1926 on the occasion of the death of her husband. And she says about her husband, "He was buried under the lilacs in our front yard without any religious ceremony by request, as he was an infidel. And like Tom Paine, he believed in God and hoped for immortality." Now, I too hope for immortality, but I think in a different way than this long-gone relative. I feel that we all will still share in that continuity of history after we're gone. And I think that we share in it through our descendants, through whatever we do or make during our lives, and through the people whose lives we have touched as we pass through. Thank you.
A couple of times a year, all of us are introduced to this next speaker when we come up to purchase books in the book sale. Mike Page has been doing this for, I've forgotten how many years, how many tens of thousands of dollars he and his sidekick, Elaine Ronez, have raised for the church during these years. I first appeared on the scene in 1916 in Boston and attended Lowell Institute. He describes it as a night version of MIT in electrical engineering. He was drafted or volunteered into the Army Air Corps during World War II, and they sent him to a course in psychology at Stanford. ended up preparing evaluations using his mathematics and his psychology training for evaluating bombardiers in Texas. Went on to George Washington, became a mathematical statistician. And he entered the Bureau of Labor Statistics and rotated between that and Commerce, Economic Department, World Bank, retiring in 1973. He admits to playing the classical violin a number of years ago. And he and his lovely wife, Naomi, have graced these halls for many, many years. He's been a consultant in various enterprises in the local area and in Washington. Been here at church since 1960. Taught RE, taught music, and writes program notes and concerts. Please welcome Mike Krogh.
I got along something people use in their kitchens to time cook. So I'll set it for 5 minutes. There it goes. One of my principal interests in life has been music ever since I was a child and when I studied the violin. My father was a painter, and the man who taught me violin lessons got his house painted in return at the cost of the lessons. He may have gotten more out of it than I did. I have a number of things I want to say. Incidentally, before I get into what I have written down here, I did want to note that the choral song this morning is treated wonderfully by Charles Ives, if you ever have a chance to hear that. And Stravinsky has written The Emperor's Nightingale, which is a wonderful work also. And Lewis Thomas has a chapter in one of his books called On Hearing Mahler's Ninth Symphony. So you see, music pervades the world in many of its aspects. Now, why do people live as long as they do? There are, of course, a variety of reasons, but one possible element present in this is the role of laughter. Norman Cousins, who died not long ago, was ill many years ago and was considered to be beyond hope by his doctors. And then he had them show him some films, I think it was of the Marx Brothers. And laughing at that restored his health. And he wrote a couple of books about it subsequently. And laughter, I think, is something that those of us who are very serious could perhaps turn to occasionally. Now, there are, of course, times when it is difficult to laugh at the world or at our own troubles. But I know there are other times when this can be done. So I recommend it. I'll probably have a few little stories to tell as I go along. Music to me has actually been something very close to religion. I used to keep a diary, and I recall noting in it that some compositions that I heard gave me an exalted feeling, something that I think that other people get perhaps by looking at a beautiful painting or hearing or reading or hearing a poem by some famous poet or seeing a play by Shakespeare. But I got that feeling from music. I still get it to some extent, although I must say that with the passage of time, some of this passion has diminished. And that, of course, I guess is unavoidable my career has been a function, I'll say, to some extent, which is chance events. I don't know the extent to which that applies to other people. I know it certainly applies in my case. How I happen to go from one place to another, part of my career was conditioned by the fact that during the term of office of our beloved President Harry Truman, we had a flourishing activity called loyalty boards. And I was sent a letter by the loyalty board at that time of the Commerce Department asking me whether I had anything subversive to report. And I wrote back to them saying that, no, I was just an innocent bystander for the most part. And they were prepared to accept that. At least they didn't write back to me. But I think that probably ended up in my files in the FBI, and someday, if I can overcome my present lethargy, I plan to use the Freedom of Information Act to find out exactly what they do have on me. Well, I think I'll stop with this one.
Our next speaker is from New England. Many of these people are from the New England area. Some of them were born in Maine. He did admit to being going back to 1912, and he's a Harvard man and graduated in, of course, government. Putting his training to use, he began with the Social Security Administration in 1937, virtually at its inception, and stayed with it for 30 years, and becomes a public information officer. After the death of his first wife, he came up here to church in 1959 and started with MVUC in many various aspects. While he was still public information officer, he said one day he was just sitting at his desk, minding his own business, and this woman, a very attractive woman, walked in who worked for the Commerce Department. And she had to write a speech for the Secretary of Commerce and had to have something about Social Security. And so she came in to ask him about it. And Elsa has been around the scene ever since. He's been here for, since virtually its inception. He's been the board chairman of the Board of Trustees. And he and Elsa, in fact, married the old chap way down there that had his own cell lot. And one of his enduring complaints is that they never put a plaque on his memory that effect. Please welcome King Court.
I don't want to counteract George Churchill's fine speech about fine speech, honest speech. Because a few years ago, I think during a campaign, and apparently we had given an adequate amount to the campaign, Henry, you could be honored. And one of the honors that I think we qualified for was being a pillar of the church. Now, one of my pet interests is metaphors. And I don't like mechanical, structural metaphors. And other people don't like them. We believe metaphors should be living, organic. So I rejected the idea of being a pillar, a piece of a building. That was not that. But I'm going to talk a little about metaphors, and in particular about the metaphor of gardens. In their 1991 book, which many of you may have read, called The Feminine Side of God, Sherry Anderson and Patricia Hopkins report on their interviews with 30 women about their spiritual development. My interest is not in that general problem of spiritual problem or question about spiritual development. But after the authors had finished their interviews, and they had a vast amount of information, they had trouble finding how to put it together in some pattern, in some model, in some metaphor. And so they thought about it. They did not want anything hierarchical, mechanical, no pyramids, no ladders, nothing. It was not organic. And they, according to the book, we needed something as organic and complex as the women themselves. Something with cycles, parts that are interdependent. Something that is living. Something like a garden. And this garden metaphor worked in their book, particularly describing each woman's sacred garden. The metaphor of the garden worked at an individual level, but what had fascinated me even more over my development of my life is the application of the garden metaphor to trying to describe our earth, our planet, and our universe. In A God Within, Vernon Unitarian wrote, although the earth is but a tiny island in the midst of vast reaches of alien space, it derives unique distinction from being alone in the solar system, like a magic garden, blooming with myriads of different living things which have prepared the way for self-reflecting human beings. Frederick Ferret wrote, the world is portrayed, this is in the book of his, neither as a mere resource pit to be mined, nor as a sheer wilderness to be shunned, but as a complex garden to be tended, respected, harvested, and loved. In the image of the garden, if the image of the garden, in which humanity and the rest of nature interact with balance and mutual benefit, becomes the fundamental picture of the world, we see the problem, it will be easier to fit the machine, the idea, the model of a machine world, easier to fit the model of a machine world into the image of a garden than it is to try to fit a garden into a machine. The idea of a garden as a place both real and metaphorical, where nature and culture can be wedded in a way that is of mutual benefit, is appropriate for our church. Our founding members came here in part because of Boxwood Gardens. We've had many, many members spend uncounted hours caring for the grounds, which incidentally I refuse to call grounds, but the grounds committee we have. I call them gardens. When 30 years ago we debated whether or not to leave so-called Holy Hill here for this garden and move down on Forehand Road, where we would be more public and people could see us and perhaps come. The question of not leaving the gardens was one of the issues. Not only the gardens, which had to be cared for, but also, of course, the view. So I think the reason I'm talking about this is because talking about the church and my experiences in life, that this image of the world, of our lives, of the church as a garden is worthy of being in our pervading consciousness. Not necessarily worried about the detail, but just a basic general idea, so that we'll have a metaphor that is living, organic, and biological. That's one aspect out of my experience here in the church and elsewhere. Thank you.
For many years, if you attended a wedding, reception, or other event on it that was made by Diane. She was born in 1920, graduated from Brown University. Shortly after that, married Bill McClellan. Spent the 4 years in San Antonio, moving to Minneapolis with her husband, and she worked for General Mills. She worked for the original Betty Crocker, getting her start on cooking skills. Back to Brown again for the site department projects along with her husband. Spent the Korea War in Sacramento and Washington, and finally back to Washington, where she joined MVUC in 1961, working with the core workshop and becoming one of the principal church cooks. She left the kitchen to become, escaped the kitchen in her words, to become one of the Fairfax County School librarians, retiring after 15 years back to the church kitchen. She sometimes comes back and helps out with these and lends her institutional memory, her grace, and her good sense to many an occasion here, including the Board of Trustees twice. Please welcome Diane McClellan.
What are my thoughts at being officially labeled a senior emeritus? That's what the little blurb in last week's program called us. Mostly surprised at finding myself up here, when really inside, I'm just early middle-aged, if that. But how did I get here from there? There being 1961, when Bill and I began driving up that winding road through the woods with our kids. How am I different from what I was 32 years ago? For one thing, I'm single again. Not half of a set. That's what a proper wife was supposed to be in the 50s and early 60s. But someone in my own right. As such, I've moved into a new way of life, one which MVUC has been a major force in supporting. This is a true community here, which welcomes us all wherever we are, and wherever we go from there. MVUC is a community which helps me welcome change, the one constant in our lives. We're always on the way to becoming. I don't think we're ever finished people, except maybe when friends get up and say those nice things in the memorial service. And the same thing is true of this church, and that can sometimes be hard to accept, but it's so essential that we as an institution keep evolving too. I hope I never lose the capacity to be surprised at what life deals me, and to enjoy those surprises, although sometimes that takes a little time. Like the surprise from those balky teenagers who rejected everything you thought important, become responsible adults who subscribe to your basic values, though usually in a somewhat different form. And what a pleasure to overhear them telling their kids to write thank yous, Christmas thank yous, and pick up their rooms. Echoes of your voice so many years before. Remember how you muttered, just wait till you have kids. I'm more and more aware as time goes by that things often don't turn around just as you plan, and these surprises can add interesting spice to it. When I was much younger, I had a romantic picture in my mind, from Jeanette MacDonald Nelson Eddy movies, no doubt. There'd be a lake, a balmy summer evening, and a full moon, and I'd be reclining gracefully in a canoe on that lake, trailing my hand in the water while a handsome swain paddled me around, playing his guitar and singing. Once I thought I had everything needful for making this dream a reality. I spent summers at a nice little lake in New England. I even had a red canoe, and finally along came Bill McClellan, certified Boy Scout canoeing instructor. Also owned a guitar and a nice tenor voice. So one night we launched the canoe and headed into movie land. Perhaps you've already noticed the flaw in this perfect arrangement. We soon discovered that one can't paddle the canoe and play the guitar and sing simultaneously. The final picture featured me paddling, while Bill reclined in the canoe and played the guitar. remembering selectively. Take copious notes, but edit what you keep permanently. Life and change are going to happen, that's for sure. I certainly don't know what's next, so I'll just go on being surprised.
We conclude our presentations this morning. With a study of courage. Chuck Martinson was 30-something at the beginning of World War II with a family, wife and children, and left Des Moines, Iowa Chamber of Commerce for Washington, D.C. to seek other employment in the nation's capital. The Des Moines Draft Board, upon discovering that he was working in Washington, determined that he was no longer essential and reclassified him 1A. He figured that he better get a jump on him, and he tried to enlist in the Army. They were not very smart, and they did not accept him. The Navy was more astute, made him a lieutenant, and put him on a destroyer in the Pacific for the remainder of the war. He then became an expert in association management, and directed the National Office Products Association here in Alexandria, and has became a consultant, I do believe, with the American Society for Association Executives. His entire family becomes synonymous with MVUC, contributing their many talents to the congregation. Chuck has undergone surgery. He, as most of you know, speaks through a voice synthesizer, and is opted to have his charming wife, Wilma, present his thoughts this morning. Wilma, please welcome her.
So I will be speaking his words here. When I was Executive Vice President of the National Office Products Association, in the early 60s, Wilma and I were basking in our vicarious connection with the Kennedy White House, which came about through our daughter Sue. When Sue graduated from Penn State, she got a job on John Kennedy's staff and was with him through West Virginia and the rest of the campaign, and ended as secretary to Pierre Salinger, who became press secretary when Jack was elected. Sue loved her job, which included extensive and close association with the Kennedys and the leading figures in the cabinet, the administration, and the press. And we followed developments as reported by Sue with zealous interest and enthusiasm. As it turned out, Sue's Kennedy connections had a major part in setting up one of my most vivid recollections. Things developed this way. Our executive committee was 99.9% Republican in political loyalty. And this was the time that Ronald Reagan was making hay as the General Electric-sponsored crusader for less government and a return to the good old days. Accordingly, much against my will, they forced me to invite Reagan to be our main luncheon speaker at our West Coast convention in San Francisco. Reluctantly, I issued the invitation to Reagan through his agent. The reply came back saying Ron would be delighted to accept for a fee of $5,000, saying that was a lot of money in 1962, subject to a 90-day cancellation clause in case something better came along. The cancellation clause gave me a way out, so I wrote back to the agent saying, thanks, but no thanks, not with the cancellation clause. The agent never replied, and after a decent interval of 4 to 5 weeks, I asked Sue if Pierre would like to be our convention speaker. Due to Sue's good efforts and influence with Pierre, and because Pierre likes San Francisco anyhow, he accepted our invitation with no fee involved. Thus, I had saved the association $5,000 while assuring us of a colorful and witty speaker with whom I was in political cahoots. The opening of the West Coast Convention proceeded according to plan, We had a fine opening cocktail reception. The lunch where Salinger would be the speaker was sold out. And as the morning session opened with lively participation,